And we're seeing a lot of that today, too. So it's the windstorms, the epic, biblical, historic floods that are happening repeatedly, the storms that are so big in hurricanes, basically, land hurricanes that have such a wide diameter. We've never seen them so wide, so great in diameter before. Should know this because we've got to get prepared. But the basic, I think what we need to do, and I think you know too, that what we have to emphasize is, folks, just start saving. Don't throw away your plastic bottles. Rinse them out real well with hot water. Fill them up with tap water and store them in your basement. Get shelving that you can make, like pieces of plywood. You can put pieces of plywood in between each layer of bottles so that you don't need these big expensive shelves, which actually waste a lot of height space because you're not going to make, you can have a lot of empty space in between, the second shelf and the third shelf. So I just take basically that masonite or particle wood, which is rather thin, 1/8 inch, and I use that to separate layers of bottles. Of course, you want to take all the bottles that are pretty much the same height, put them all together in one layer, and then maybe I make one stack about maybe 20 inches by 24, 20 by 24, and that'll be one stack of bottles, and then I put some masonite or particle board or even plywood in between each layer so I can get about 4 or 5 layers of bottles.
Right.
I have to choose, again, the ones that are very, very often, though, you get bottles that are not exactly the same height, a little bit different. So what I do is I take a piece of cardboard, which is somewhat compressible, and some of that cushiony foam packing material. It's like sheets. It comes in sheets. It's about an 1/8 inch or more in thickness. And I put that in with a layer, sandwich that in with a layer of cardboard so that any disparity in the heights of some of the bottles will be compensated for by the cushioning effect of that separating cardboard sandwich with that spongy packing material, that spongy sheets of packing material. So anyway, it's a little bit time consuming, but my basement is getting such that even though I have many, many, many bottles of water, I've got more empty bottles now than full bottles, and it's getting out of control. I've got to do something about it. I've got to make it. I know I can't do it all in one day, so I'm going to have to make it a ritual to fill up, say, 5 bottles a day. Rinse out, fill up, get all the bottles of the same height, put them together, and fill them up. Keep on making layers, because still got a lot of space between. I get, a height that I can use up before the weight of the bottles gets too heavy, and starts to jeopardize the stability of the bottom layer. You know what I mean? Too many layers there because you don't know if it's going to withstand all that weight. But I still got a lot to go. Anyway, that sounds mundane, sounds trivial, but it's the most important thing because when we lose power, which we're going to lose, and it's going to be for a long time. I'm not making this up. This comes from none other than the White House. You can look up the White House. I just posted it. My friend sent it to me. Actually, an executive order or some kind of, what's his name? Ed Koppel, who used to be a ABC TV evening reporter. Koppel, remember him? An entire book. And now Dr. Michio Kaku, a physicist at State University, I think, New York, City University in New York, also is warning about it. So many people are warning about these power outage failures long term. The reason they would be long term is because the solar emissions that I was just talking about are what is causing, I believe, long-term chronic solar blasting. Is hitting the Earth's magnetic field. And you had asked me a question which I didn't really address yet. You said, has it got anything to do with our magnetic field? And, well, the sun's solar electrified particles, protons and electrons, that are being blasted out in all directions, some of which strike Earth's magnetic field. Well, those moving electrons, as I mentioned before, they themselves, those streams of electrons coming from the sun and streams of protons, actually create each stream creates a little old magnetic field encircling it concentrically, like sort of like a spring. If you were to take an arrow, here's another analogy, put an arrow through a coiled spring, a garage door spring, and that arrow would represent the travel, straight line travel of the protons, which are positive electrically charged particles, or also that arrow would represent the straight line travel of the electrons, which are negative electric particles. Mm-hmm. Well, both kinds of particles create magnetic fields, which are sort of analogous in shape, anyway, to the coiled garage door spring. So you've got all these magnetic fields that are impacting trillions of them, in a big solar wave of particles called the solar wind, and blasting the Earth's magnetic field, creating electromagnetic streams like coils that I just described, which impact Earth's magnetic field. And now you have what I liken to electromagnetic jousting, where you see two people fighting with swords or with these long jousting poles, and knights in armor jousting one another. Well, you have the jousting of magnetic fields between the sun's solar blasting of magnetic fields and the Earth's magnetic field. And this impacts the Earth's magnetic field. It feeds back that energy from the sun, electromagnetic energy from the sun feeds back electromagnetically, right, from the Earth's outer core, like the skin of an apple, along the skin, right into the top of the apple, the dimple at the top of the apple, that goes into the center core, if you liken the Earth to an apple. So that electromagnetic energy travels thousands of miles from the Earth's magnetic field in space right into the center of Earth, wherein is located our Earth's solid metal inner core. And that's what I believe has been laterally shifting Earth's solid metal inner core off of its center point and eventually causing the jet stream to ripple like a roller coaster. The ancients, let's go by past reports, the ancient survivors of the last incursion of Planet X into our solar system, which occurred around 36 and a half centuries ago. And we can prove it. I'll try to make it quick, because I don't want to get too far off of one point. I want to prove to you that it occurred 36 and a half centuries ago. Our geologists studying the great Santorini explosion, which had a volcanic explosive index, VEI, greater than according to their studies of past geological events, greater than we've ever experienced in modern days. The great volcanic explosion of the Santorini volcano in the Aegean Sea on the island of Thera. It's well known. It destroyed the Minoan, highly civilized Minoan civilization. Well, that volcanic explosion, they can date it back by counting tree rings. Tree rings are a great way to with high resolution determine a date in ancient history, because each year, as you know, the trees will grow one layer of skin. Mm-hmm. And then each year that skin piles up and builds up, so that if you were to cut the tree, you would be able to count the layers and tell the age of the tree. We all know that. So I guess the trees they're looking at were petrified trees, where they were able to do carbon dating, and with carbon dating you could determine the date of something that's petrified. So when you would put that together, the carbon dating put together with the counting of the rings, scientists have been able to actually determine when the great volcanic explosion of the Santorini volcano occurred. It caused tree rings to become narrowed, because obviously when a volcano explodes, when many volcanoes explode around the world, they kick up all this black ash that blocks out the sunlight. So now the vegetation becomes starved. And that's why you see narrow tree rings, which they can count almost to the year, plus or minus 10 years. Count to be somewhere around, as I recall, 1630 BC, 1640, somewhere around there. I don't even remember the exact year. But you can look it up on Wikipedia. that's another good thing about, me putting out all this information. People might say, well, he sounds like convincing, but I don't know. He's just saying a lot of words. Well, it's your opportunity, folks. You can prove it all. Grab a pen and paper now. I forgot to tell you from the beginning of the show. Start writing down keywords that I mentioned. Santorini, Santorini, volcano, and BC. Write down the term BC. And then you'll get reports as to when they believe that it exploded just by counting tree rings. They counted the tree rings in the British Isles and in Canada, and they found it all to be the same. This great narrowing of tree rings occurred around 1650, approximately, plus or minus 10 years BC. So, now that was like 36 and a half centuries ago. And we've all been told that Planet X comes in every 36 and a half centuries because it is on a cometary orbit. Comets are like a pendulum, a cosmic pendulum that swings back and forth. Now, we all know that a pendulum on a grandfather's clock is very precisely periodic, regularly, uniformly periodic. You can count you can measure the number of seconds or fractions of a second that a grandfather's clock pendulum swings. Well, similarly, we have cosmic pendulum, which are comets. Comets come into the sun, and what is the force that's pulling them in? It's the sun. The sun pulls them in, they come in, and some of them crash into the sun and cease to exist. Others, like Halley's Comet, we know come in at amazingly regular intervals of, I think it's something like every 75 years Halley's Comet comes in. So imagine a bigger comet, what they call long period comets, taking not 75 years to come in, but 36 and a half centuries to come in and out. But it's regular, it's predictable, it's chronologically predictable. So now we have we're saying 36 and a half centuries. Well, how can we prove what we've been told, that this Planet X comes in every 36 and a half centuries? We know for sure that the geologists or the ancient the ecologists who study ancient ecology have proven that the tree rings were narrowed roughly 36 and a half centuries ago, around 1650 BC, which coincides with the great exodus of the Israelites from Egypt, which is historically recorded in the book of Exodus of the Bible. Okay, but we still don't know if it's every 36 and a half centuries unless we can go back another 36 and a half centuries before 1650 BC and prove it, that it's periodically regular, uniform. Well, let's go back count back, do some arithmetic, and go back from 1650 BC, when the great exodus of the Israelites occurred from Egypt, where God created all these natural disasters due to comets coming into our solar system. God created all this to liberate the Israelites from Egypt. 36 and a half centuries before 1650 BC takes you, 36 and a half centuries before 1650 BC takes you to around 5300 BC. I didn't do the arithmetic now because I had done it before, and I already remembered. 5300 BC was the previous incursion, the second past incursion of Planet X into our solar system. Now, if that's true, we should see geological disasters occurring around 5300 BC. And sure enough, there are two famous geologists, Pittman. People should be writing this down, checking it out, because the only way you're going to really believe it is when you look it up yourself and do, wow, I've done the research myself. I can take this to the bank. I know it's happening. Therefore, I know I must get prepared. Whereas if you just hear me say it and you don't check it out yourself, you're not going to believe it, and you're not going to get prepared. So you write down Pittman and Ryan, I think it's Pittmann, and Ryan, Ryan. Just look up those two names, and just write in the term BC, and you'll get some of their reports that they had done research on the Black Sea. This Black Sea had actually overflowed, and when it was like sort of on a plateau, I believe, as I recall, and it overflowed into the Straits of Bosphorus. I'm just going by memory, so I may have some the variations in my recollection that are not accurate, but I'm pretty sure it overflowed into the Straits of Bosphorus or into the Mediterranean somehow. And they've shown from studying silt deposits in the Black Sea that overflow, that great flooding overflow of the Black Sea occurred around 5300 BC. So now we have 2 points, 2 index points to show us, yeah, look, we can measure between 1650 BC, the disasters of the tree rings narrowing, the explosion of the great Santorini volcano, and many, many other volcanoes on Earth, 1650 BC. Use that as one index point, and then another index point would be 5300 BC. So there you go. That is 36 and a half centuries ago. Between disastrous events, 36 and a half centuries. But let's try to go back one more, just to seal our evidence that indeed that the period, the time between each great Earth disaster is about 36 and a half centuries. We need to know this, because if it's true, then the next Earth disaster is about to occur sometime soon, in the foreseeable future. Okay, let's go back let's count back 36 and a half centuries back before 5300 BC, which was the great flood of Noah's day, 5300 BC. Let's count back 36 and a half centuries before that, and you wind up around 9000 BC. Now, many people, it's so far back that many people are confused or mistaken about dating the great sinking of Atlantis. But some of your best archaeologists are saying they believe it occurred around 9000 BC. And if that's true, and I believe it is, 9000 BC was when the great sinking of Atlantis occurred. That was a tremendous Earth disaster. The greatest disaster is going to be loss of power for months and years, probably years, because these $1 million transformers that can only come from China. And how are you going to get them from China if China has power outages and there's no shipping because there's no power at the ports and there's no transportation on the highways because all the power is out? So those $1 million transformers that are needed to replace the ones that are blown and sizzled by the solar blasting that's about to occur, which our government tells us is going to occur, those transformers will never get here. So we'll have, you might as well say, the remainder of our lifetime, we'll have to live without power. It's going to be disastrous. Starvation. Nobody knows how to grow food. But so you got to store food. Store much canned food, dry grains and stuff. I don't have to tell you all about a high protein grain that they kept the Incas alive on. Well, it's going to be disastrous. Well, first thing we've got to do is store enough food to keep us alive for a while until we get the hang of growing our own food, but which means we've got to start storing seeds. And, you can get a lot of nutrition out of the stuff that you grow indoors. Like, for example, you can get enough to keep you alive almost if you sprout inside using jars in your house. So, and this way, when you've got the protection of your house to keep your food sheltered. But whereas if you have a garden outside, your starving neighbors are going to become marauders. They and their families are starving. So you can't grow anything outdoors when there's a society is in chaos, in starvation mode. But this is bad news, but it's also good news. If you can store enough food and keep yourself under cover long enough, I hate to even say this, but in a couple of weeks, everybody else who threatens you, they'll be dead. So you won't have any threats around you.
Yeah, and that is definitely one of the bittersweet things that we will have to deal with. It's always a bummer to know that people will die and people will suffer. However, for those of us who are prepared, we know that there's a certain window that we have to be really worried in, and then after that, most of the people will be folks who were prepared or folks who have made it to that point and who are now able to take care of themselves. So, what about brown dwarfs and the fact that they spew a lot of helium? Could that be something that would really have an impact on our planet if planet Nibiru, or if the Nibiru system is led by a brown dwarf through our section of the galaxy? Could the helium, or maybe even the iron rust that it's putting off, have a massive effect on our planet?
Not sure. I'm not sure if it does spew out helium. Like, for example, Jupiter, our largest planet in our solar system, is similar in nature to a brown dwarf. It's similar in nature to Planet X insofar as it is a gas giant, and it's almost large enough to actually create nuclear fusion, as our sun does. Now, there's methane. I don't know what the gases are. Maybe methane. I haven't really studied it too well. I don't know anything about helium. No, wait a minute. Maybe you're right. You're right. When you have nuclear fusion, you have helium produced. Right, because the sun actually produces helium in nuclear fusion. It fuses hydrogen, which has a nucleus of one. The nucleus of hydrogen is very small, the smallest of all the elements, I believe. It has only one proton in its nucleus, whereas most of the other atoms have more than one proton in their nuclei, which defines their character. Oxygen, for example, has 16 protons comprising its nucleus, that's the characteristic of oxygen. That's just an example. Hydrogen has only one proton. So what happens with hydrogen is when you have nuclear fusion, two hydrogen atoms are actually crunched together, and you wind up with not H1 hydrogen, but H2. That's the number 2 represents the number of protons in the nucleus, and you wind up with the distinct element of helium. Does have helium and the nuclear fusion. I don't know how much is spewed out. I can tell you with our sun. Our sun is another good example, a good way of describing the chemical characteristics of a brown dwarf star, because our sun is a star. It's just bigger than a brown dwarf star. So, but our sun blows out electrons and protons, again, which are protons which are hydrogen nuclei minus their single valence electron. So it blows out hydrogen and electrons, but hydrogen protons, I should say, and electrons. But I don't know anything about the sun blowing out helium.
Yeah, and that was just something that I had come across and read while I was reading about the fact that they had found helium-3 on the moon, and obviously helium-3 is a rare element, but they say that 1 ton of helium-3 could actually power the United States with clean energy for a year. So 2,000 pounds of this helium-3, if they could bring it back from the moon, which has an abundance of helium-3 up there. We don't have a whole lot on planet Earth. It's very, very hard to extract any here, but there's an abundance on the moon. So if they could bring that back, 2,000 pounds of it, it's enough to power the United States for a whole year. So obviously that is something that we would want to look into if we can, if it's feasible as a source of renewable energy. But then I read about the helium being put off by brown dwarfs, and was wondering if that could be a huge issue if it passed close by, putting off all that iron oxide dust and the levels of helium that it would be putting off. That helium gets into our atmosphere, and obviously it's a greenhouse gas, so it could cause havoc within the atmosphere. But that point's neither here nor there, I guess.
I mean, this brown dwarf star is like a vacuum cleaner or a magnet in space. As it travels through space, junk-littered deep space, I mean far beyond our solar system, comes in from millions, billions of miles away, and it drags and gravitationally attracts all kinds of objects. It attracts small planets, it attracts comets, it attracts asteroids, it attracts even iron oxide dust. That's particles of all sizes. So when it comes in, it looks like a hazy green, hazy red object. And someone has actually taken, somehow smuggled pictures, films of it, at least a film clip of this Planet X, which we believe came from the South Pole Telescope. It's a quasi-secret telescopic location of infrared telescopic site that our government has secretly erected in the South Pole, the harshest environment you can imagine. Why would they do that? Putting up a telescope in the harshest environment on Earth in the South Pole, because that's where Planet X was coming in, below the Earth's ecliptic, between the solar system's ecliptic plane, which is that imaginary disk in space. I visualize it as like a glass disk on which all the planets revolve around the sun. And someone captured these films and put them on the internet under the name Nibiru Shock 2012, and they were taken down really quickly. And I just hope that person who may have worked at that South Pole Telescope is still alive. But the bottom, basically what I was saying was that the pictures show, and I have them on my website too, is a hazy red glow around this object. It looks almost like a flame of a candle. If you were to run with a candle in your outstretched arm, the flame would sort of be pulled back, stretched backwards. And that's what this object looks like, with a stretched backwards tail.
Where can we find these pictures of what you're talking about?
TheLightOfDayRadioShow.com. When you go there, you'll see a big Planet X logo at the top of the page. Click on that logo. You have to wait a few seconds for it to load, because there's a tremendous number of my audio interviews and my Planet X audio dramas, very interesting, exciting musical dramas that I put up about Planet X. So it's loaded with lots of data, and it takes a little while to load. But when you click on that Planet X logo at the top of the page of TheLightOfDayRadioShow.com, it'll take you to my Planet X page. And then you'll see at the very top is a clip of that Nibiru Shock 2012 release, which was suppressed.
Okay, and with that, we're going to take a quick bio break. And that will wrap up section 2 or part 2 of this interview. Be sure and stick around. Parts 3 and 4 will be coming out soon, hopefully this evening. And I hope you're enjoying this lecture series. And for now, that's about all. We're going to wrap it up, and we will talk to you soon.
Going to be for a long time. I'm not making this up. This comes from none other than the White House. You can look up the White House. I just posted it. My friend sent it to me. Actually, an executive order or some kind of, what's his name? Ed Koppel, who used to be a ABC TV evening reporter. Koppel, remember him? An entire book. And now Dr. Michio Kaku, a physicist at State University, I think, New York. City University in New York, also is warning about it. So many people are warning about these power outage failures long term. The reason they would be long term is because the solar emissions that I was just talking about are what is causing, I believe, long-term chronic solar blasting. Is hitting the Earth's magnetic field. And you had asked me a question which I didn't really address yet. You said, has it got anything to do with our magnetic field? And, well, the sun, and I think you know, too, that what we have to emphasize is, folks, just start saving. Don't throw away your plastic bottles. Rinse them out real well with hot water. Fill them up with tap water. And store them in your basement. Get shelving that you can make, like pieces of plywood. you can put pieces of plywood in between each layer of bottles so that you don't need these big expensive shelves, which actually waste a lot of height space because you're not going to make, you can have a lot of empty space in between, the second shelf and the third shelf. So I just take basically that masonite or particle wood, which is rather thin, 1/8 inch, and I use that to separate layers of bottles. Of course, you want to take all the bottles that are pretty much the same height, put them all together in one layer, and then maybe I make one stack about maybe 20 inches by 24, 20 by 24, and that'll be one stack of bottles, and then I put some masonite or particle board or even plywood in between each layer so I can get about 4 or 5 layers of bottles.
Right.
I have to choose, again, the ones that are very, very often, though, you get bottles that are not exactly the same height, a little bit different. So what I do is I take a piece of cardboard, which is somewhat compressible, and some of that cushiony foam packing material. It's like sheets. It comes in sheets. It's about an 1/8 inch or more in thickness. And I put that in with a layer, sandwich that in with a layer of cardboard so that any disparity in the heights of some of the bottles will be compensated for by the cushioning effect of that separating cardboard sandwich with that spongy packing material, that spongy sheets of packing material. So anyway, it's a little bit time. Nowadays. And we're seeing a lot of that today, too. So it's the windstorms, the epic, biblical, historic floods that are happening repeatedly, the storms that are so big in hurricanes, basically, land hurricanes that have such a wide diameter. We've never seen them so wide, so great in diameter before. Should know this because we've got to get prepared. But the basic, I think what we need to do, and I'm consuming, but my basement is getting such that even though I have many, many, many bottles of water, I've got more empty bottles now than full bottles, and it's getting out of control. I've got to do something about it. I've got to make it. I know I can't do it all in one day, so I'm going to have to make it a ritual to fill up, say, 5 bottles a day. Rinse out, fill up, get all the bottles of the same height, put them together, and fill them up. Keep on making layers, because I still got a lot of space between. I get, a height that I can use up before the weight of the bottles gets too heavy, and starts to jeopardize the stability of the bottom layer. You know what I mean? Too many layers there because you don't know if it's going to withstand all that weight. But I still got a lot to go. Anyway, that sounds mundane, sounds trivial. But it's the most important thing because when we lose power, which we're going to lose, and it's going